The wind howled through the black mouth of the cast cavern like a dying breath. It was the brutal winter of 1484. An imperial army huddled in the freezing snow beneath a fortress that seemed to bleed directly out of the living mountain. The soldiers were starving and shivering and dying in the dark. Their eyes stared up at the impossible stone walls of Predjama Castle with utter despair. Suddenly, the sky seemed to mock their suffering. A rain of fresh red cherries tumbled down from the battlements above and splattered like drops of blood into the pristine white snow. How could this be possible? The fortress was entirely surrounded and cut off from the world, yet the Lord of the Mountain was feasting while the men below froze to death. Predjama Castle stands today in Slovenia as an awe-inspiring monument to dangerous human defiance. It is a sheer wall of pale stone wedged violently into a gaping black abyss. It looks completely invincible, yet this impenetrable fortress would soon become a nightmare tomb for its arrogant master. The enemy would never need to breach those massive outer walls to claim his life. So what dark betrayal caused the invincible Lord of the Mountain to die in the most vulnerable and humiliating way imaginable? What incredible dark human truths are buried beneath these silent stones? To understand the tragedy of Erazem Lueger, we must look past the glory and stare into the paranoid soul of the man who built this trap. Erazem did not build a home, but rather a monument to absolute terror. He was a knight obsessed with an impossible dream of complete invulnerability. He looked at a sheer cliff face and a yawning black cavern and saw a fortress that God himself could not tear down. His blinding ego demanded that he fuse human stone with the living mountain. The castle became an extension of his own paranoid mind, but the mountain exacted a terrible toll for this illusion of safety. Creating this masterpiece required sheer defiance of nature and brutal sacrifice. The men who hauled the white stones up the vertical rock face suffered terribly in the freezing winds. Life inside the cavern was not a royal dream, but a damp, rotting nightmare. The historically accurate atmosphere of the time was one of overwhelming gloom and perpetual twilight. Water constantly dripped down the black cave walls. The freezing chill seeped into the marrow of their bones. The fortress was practically unlivable for a nobleman, yet Erazem endured the rotting cold because the fortress fed his ultimate obsession. He traded sunlight and warmth for the absolute certainty that no enemy could ever touch him. This blinding arrogance planted the seed of his own destruction. Erazem stood upon his impregnable balcony and looked down at the world, believing his mastery of the ancient cast caves made him immortal. He poured his wealth and soul into securing the front gates against armies and empires. He built a fortress that no army could ever hope to enter, but he forgot the most terrifying truth of siege warfare. Walls built thick enough to keep your enemies out will also trap you inside with your closest friends. The year 1483 tore away the illusion. The fragile peace of the mountain domain completely shattered when Erazem Lueger allowed his violent, vengeful heart to dictate his ultimate fate. His dearest and most loyal friend, Andreas Baumkircher, had been brutally executed by the Habsburgs. This execution was a calculated political murder. The news reached the damp caverns of Predjama, and grief twisted Erazem into a weapon of uncontrollable blinding rage. Erazem rode aggressively to the imperial court in Vienna, seeking honor and justice, but he found only cold, aristocratic arrogance. The imperial army commander, Marshal Pappenheim, laughed and openly mocked the memory of his dead friend. That mockery sealed his doom. Erazem did not hesitate or consider the political consequences. He drew his heavy blade and slaughtered the high-ranking commander right there in the very shadow of the emperor. Hot blood stained the polished imperial floor. The entire court froze in absolute shock. Erazem fled the city immediately, knowing he had just violently declared war on the single most powerful empire on the continent. He spurred his terrified horse back to the harsh mountains, riding without sleep or food until the gaping black maw of Predjama Castle finally welcomed him home. He shouted frantic orders to his men. They raised the heavy wooden drawbridge and violently dropped the massive iron portcullis into place. Erazem paced the freezing stone floors of his dark cave fortress, listening to the endless dripping water. He felt truly invincible. He locked the heavy iron gates, believing he had completely outsmarted Emperor Frederick III. and the entire combined might of the Holy Roman Empire. But the emperor possessed a quiet anger as deep and unyielding as the cast stone itself. The imperial court archives from that bitter season describe an atmosphere of pure lethal fury. The emperor refused to allow a mere robber baron to embarrass the sovereign crown. He did not merely want a quiet, secretive assassination in the dark. He demanded a brutal public spectacle of total annihilation. He summoned his most ruthless and cunning general Gaspar Ravbar and handed down a single, terrifying, unalterable order. Ravbar was to march an entire, heavily armed military force into the frozen, treacherous mountains and literally tear the defiant baron from his high cavern. Erazem thought his thick limestone walls would be his ultimate eternal shield. He stood confidently on his high balcony, staring down at the quiet, snow-covered valley below. He believed the brutal winter winds would protect him from retaliation. Then the distant horizon began to darken. The relentless, terrifying march of imperial steel filled the narrow mountain valley. Thousands of brutal, seasoned soldiers marched through the deep snow, dragging heavy siege engines behind them. The impossible siege of Predjama had officially begun, and the heavy jaws of the stone trap violently snapped shut. The winter of 1484 descended upon the karst mountains like a heavy shroud of white death. General Gaspar Ravbar ordered his massive imperial army to completely surround the gaping cave entrance. His objective was to starve the defiant lord into absolute submission. The strategy was brutally simple and deeply cruel. They would block all supply routes and simply wait for the freezing temperatures and gnawing hunger to break the spirit of Erazem Lueger. The historically accurate atmosphere of the imperial encampment was one of pure misery and desperation. Soldiers lost their fingers and toes to frostbite while huddled around dying smoky fires. The men outside were truly suffering, while they stared up at the unyielding pale stone of the mountain fortress. They expected to hear the cries of starving women and desperate men echoing down from the high walls. But inside the dark caverns, Erazem was not starving at all. He possessed a secret that the arrogant imperial commanders could never have imagined in their wildest dreams. The castle was not just built into the cave mouth, but it was deeply connected to a massive hidden subterranean network. A treacherous, narrow tunnel wound its way up through the solid mountain rock and opened out into the fertile Vipava Valley far beyond the imperial enemy lines. This hidden artery was his ultimate lifeline. While General Ravbar confidently waited for the rebellious knight to beg for mercy, Erazem was orchestrating a magnificent and deeply humiliating theatrical insult. He sent his most trusted men through the pitch-black dripping tunnels to gather fresh supplies from the loyal local villages. He then carried out an act of psychological warfare that completely broke the spirit of the freezing imperial army. The starving soldiers below watched in absolute disbelief as entire roasted oxen and baskets of fresh winter cherries rained down from the high, unreachable battlements. Erazem stood on his balcony, laughing at the greatest military force in all of Europe. He shouted down to the shivering, dying men, offering them fresh hot meat if they would only abandon their foolish siege. The psychological blow was absolutely devastating to the imperial morale. General Ravbar watched the fresh, bright fruit bleed into the pristine snow and felt a cold, terrifying realization wash over him. He finally understood that starving the castle was a useless fantasy, and breaking the ancient limestone with his siege engines was fundamentally impossible. The fortress was truly invincible against all physical attacks, but General Ravbar was a deeply ruthless man who understood the dark, corruptible nature of the human heart better than anyone alive. He retreated to his warm command tent and slowly pulled out a heavy leather pouch filled with pure, gleaming imperial gold. He stared at the coins, knowing that if the ancient mountain stone could not be broken, then the fragile human soul within the walls must be completely corrupted. He only needed to find one single Judas inside that impenetrable fortress to turn Erazem's perfect, invincible sanctuary into a terrifying, bloody slaughterhouse. General Gaspar Ravbar did not need to breach the impenetrable stone of the front gate. He only needed a single, terrified servant to realize that imperial gold offered a better future than a miserable freezing cave. The true identity of this cowardly traitor remains fiercely debated by modern historians, but the brutal mechanics of his absolute betrayal are completely legendary. The servants secretly accepted the heavy leather pouch of imperial gold and willingly sealed the ultimate fate of the invincible lord. We must now finally resolve the dark psychological mysteries buried deeply in the cold stones of Predjama. Erazem Lueger truly believed his mountain masterpiece was absolutely perfect, but his blinding arrogance created a fatal architectural blind spot. The magnificent aristocratic living quarters and the deep hidden caverns were entirely protected by miles of solid living rock, but the castle latrine was absolutely not. The humble outhouse was suspended dangerously over the sheer vertical cliff edge at the very outer boundary of the sprawling fortress. Its outer defensive walls were terribly thin and inherently brittle compared to the massive reinforced limestone blockade standing proudly at the front gate. It was undeniably the single most vulnerable and structurally weak point in the entire seemingly invincible fortress. It was a freezing, pitch-black, moonless night in the bitter winter of 1484. The howling wind screamed fiercely through the dark valley. Erazem Lueger left his highly secure inner bedchambers and walked confidently down the damp, dark stone corridor to use the overhanging latrine. He felt completely untouchable and utterly secure in his grand isolation. But the treacherous bribed servant was waiting silently in the cold, terrifying shadows. As soon as the heavy wooden door clicked firmly shut, the Judas moved quickly and quietly to a high, narrow window facing the distant imperial military camp. His trembling hands struck a sharp flint spark, and he deliberately lit a single solitary wax candle. Down in the freezing, miserable valley, General Ravbar stood watching the dark mountain profile. He suddenly saw the tiny, flickering yellow light pierce the total heavy darkness of the towering mountain. It was the ultimate predetermined signal of supreme human vulnerability. He immediately ordered his shivering artillerymen to load one single, massive, jagged stone boulder into their most incredibly powerful, heavy siege catapult. The skilled soldiers aimed carefully, not for the impenetrable massive front gates, but specifically for the fragile wooden structure hanging precariously off the high cliff edge. The heavy wooden catapult arms snapped violently forward with a terrifying, deafening crack that echoed loudly through the entire dark valley. The massive stone projectile soared violently upward through the freezing black night air. It violently smashed directly into the thin walls of the high latrine with an absolutely devastating, explosive force. Erazem Lueger, the supposedly invincible lord of the mountain, was instantly crushed to agonizing death by flying jagged rocks and brutally shattered timber. The invincible warlord died in the absolute most humiliating and pathetic physical vulnerability imaginable. The terrifying and profound historical irony was finally brought to a complete and devastating close. The proud, arrogant knight, who spent his entire vast fortune building a flawless stone fortress to selfishly defy mighty empires, was ultimately destroyed while sitting helplessly on a toilet simply because he foolishly trusted the wrong man. His deeply obsessive and paranoid quest for absolute impenetrable safety was exactly the precise flaw that directly caused his incredibly pathetic and entirely humiliating demise. Today the cold wind still howls through the black mouth of the karst cavern. Thousands of eager tourists arrive every single year to marvel at the impossible white stones of Predjama Castle. They stand on the high balconies taking bright photographs of the stunning, breathtaking view. They walk right past the dark, freezing tunnels where starving men once shivered and bled for a madman's impossible dream. They touch the ancient unyielding walls and admire the brilliant engineering, but they rarely see the invisible, tragic ghosts lingering deeply in the damp shadows. The legendary tale of Erazem Lueger echoes powerfully through the silent centuries as a profound and chilling warning. It stands as a timeless lesson about the destructive, blinding nature of human arrogance and the absolute tragic futility of unchecked paranoia. We spend our entire lives frantically building massive metaphorical walls to protect ourselves from the terrifying, unpredictable dangers of the outside world. We stockpile our earthly wealth and secure our grand personal fortresses, hoping to forever lock away our deepest, darkest fears. But the tragic silent stones of Predjama reveal a much darker reality. You can carve a flawless, invincible fortress directly out of the living mountain. You can build towering defensive walls thick enough and high enough to keep out an entire raging empire, but you can never ever build walls thick enough to keep out human greed